This is the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Well, welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast, the podcast where we look at our times through the lens of faith and leadership, character, and history. Great to have you with me. I want to jump right in and talk about a much misunderstood issue in our recent American politics. And frankly, it's an issue that extends back about 70 years to an earlier and misunderstood issue in American politics, and it's coming back around. And I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast are religious leaders, pastors, clergymen. I want you to pay close attention because some of what we've been told in the press might not be true, and I don't want the misunderstanding to come back and bite you. You know that we have a grand tradition in America based on the First Amendment of the state basically staying out of religion to the extent that it did not establish a church, it did not establish a national religion, and it also did not restrict individual exercise of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the religion clause of the First Amendment. And so that's been glorious in our history. And by the way, another little theme in our history is that religious organizations, because we value and cherish them in America, they are not to be taxed. This extends back as far as the Old Testament, where we are told that certain religious organizations and certain religious functions and the priests and so on would not be taxed. So this worked well in American history. And so as a result, you had religious nonprofits, organizations started for the perpetuation of religion, churches, ministries, what have you. And of course, you had non-religious nonprofits as well under law, and they would not be taxed. Now, the problem in all of this came around the early 1950s when Lyndon Baines Johnson was running for office in Texas. Now, there's a lot of humor about this because Lyndon Baines Johnson, whatever good he did in American history, whatever good he did as vice president and president, was without question somewhat corrupt in his running for office in Texas. No question about it. There was one election that was tied until suddenly, look, we found a box of ballots that had suddenly shown up and had not been counted the first time around. Nobody knew exactly where that box of ballots came from, but hey, it gave Lyndon Baines Johnson the victory in that election. One of my favorite stories that is a lot of fun is one famous American said, "My grandfather was such a devoted Democrat that though he died in 1904, he voted for Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1948. Now, I enjoy that very much because that's exactly what was going on. The names of deceased people were being put on the voting rolls. Boxes were being found. It was unbelievably corrupt. Okay? Well, let's lay that aside for the moment because that's not what we're talking about. What began to anger Lyndon Baines Johnson was that nonprofit organizations that paid no taxes to the United States, were opposing him. He was on the left side of the political spectrum. A lot of these organizations were on the right. They were opposing him in his run for Senate. So he won. He was a U.S. senator, and he decided to do something about the ability of nonprofits, organizations under the law, nonprofits that were religious, that were exempt from taxation, their ability to endorse a certain candidate. So on July 2nd, 1954, the House Special Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations ended its deliberations. And on that day, Lyndon Baines Johnson rose on the floor of the Senate and offered this amendment to the Internal Revenue Service Code pertaining to political activities by 501c3 organizations. Now, you won't believe how rapidly this change to American law entered into the books. It never came to a vote. Johnson rose in the Senate. And according to the congressional record, which I have here in front of me, he said, I have an amendment to the desk, which I should like to have stated. The officer of the court said the secretary will state the amendment, and the clerk read Johnson's modifications. Basically, Johnson's modifications modified the IRS code on the matter of whether nonprofits could endorse or support political candidates. Johnson doesn't seem to have been primarily targeting religious organizations, just basically nonprofits as a whole. And he modified the tax code so that it did not allow nonprofits to support or endorse or oppose candidates for political office. And that was it. The Republican majority accepted the amendment on unanimous consent. There were no hearings. There was no debate. There was no vote. And from that point on, you had the weird situation where nonprofits in general, in other words, organizations that are 501c3s or various organizations under the IRS code that don't pay taxes, and religious nonprofits in particular, this would mainly be churches and ministries, could not endorse candidates. Now, some of you are thinking, well, that was going on all the time anyway. And you're right. We all know that Hillary Clinton would speak at the big African-American church in New York, or that Barack Obama would speak at the big church in Birmingham or whatever. And it was tantamount to an endorsement, even though it was legal. It's perfectly fine for a political candidate to speak in a church, and no one would say everybody should vote for this person. Nevertheless, their appearance, the treatment of them by the pastor, the clergy, the prominence they were given, etc., it was clearly an endorsement because they weren't having the other side speak in that church. And this was going on a great deal. We all know also that many pastors would make their politics so clear from the pulpit it was obvious who they were going to vote for, okay? Now, all the time, even since the Johnson Amendment, it's been perfectly fine for churches and religious leaders to express themselves on certain policy issues. We're pro-abortion, we're anti-abortion, we're pro-gay agenda, we're anti-gay agenda, we're pro-Israel, etc. You could always express your views on certain issues, especially if you are encasing that in the religious values of the house. And as somebody later said, it was like having a family discussion. The pastor talking to a congregation on Sunday about certain political issues was just seen as a family discussion. The problem came in when there was an endorsement, when a pastor got up and said, we're endorsing so-and-so, or more likely, the clergy got up and said that what Mr. Bush has done with welfare or with invading Iraq or what have you is absolutely wrong. He's outside of the will of God, and we should not vote for him in the next election. That was clearly a violation. Okay, well, obviously, a lot of organizations on the right hate this, despise the Johnson Amendment, believe it was snuck into the tax code by Johnson, don't think it's right, don't think it's consistent with the Constitution. And so when Trump was in office in his first term, he made it clear that he was opposed to the Johnson Amendment, and he told his head of the IRS not to prosecute those issues, okay? Wasn't a change in law. He just wasn't going to go after people. Well, recently there has been a case in Texas, which is a relatively local case, by the way. I want to make sure that you understand this. Organizations like the National Religious Broadcasters and Intercessors for America and so on, largely religious conservative organizations, filed against this code, the Johnson Amendment, in a Texas district. Very important that we know this. This was not a federal case. And they won. They got the court to say that the Johnson Amendment is a violation of these organizations' rights under the First Amendment to endorse whoever they want. The court agreed. Now, a lot of people, a lot of conservatives are dancing in the streets. Some clergy are dancing in the streets. They're all excited that the Johnson Amendment's been overturned. Well, it hasn't. And as much as I believe, I'll go ahead and tell you what I think. I think the Johnson Amendment was a mistake. I think it was overreach, and I think it was wrong. And I think it's been violated without anybody paying any attention or anybody paying any penalties ever since. The fact is, I'm very concerned about my clergy friends I'm very concerned about my people who are religious leaders thinking it's been overturned when it has not, okay? All that has happened is that the Trump administration in its second term has said it will not prosecute. And also there's been this district court in Texas which has issued a ruling that in that district only the rights of the NRB and the rights of Intercessors for America and others, in other words, the litigants, that their rights were being violated by the Johnson Amendment. What has not happened is a nationwide modification of the IRS code. What has not happened is Congress acting to revise, to undo Johnson's insertions into the IRS code in 1954. That has not happened. So here's my concern. Will the Trump administration be going after people via the IRS, via the courts, based on a violation of the Johnson Amendment? No, they will not. Trump hates the Johnson Amendment. Was the ruling correct in Texas? Absolutely. However, it's very possible that with a change of administration, because these laws are still on the books, that another administration could prosecute on the basis of the Johnson Amendment. People would be saying, well, I thought we overthrew that. No, only in a local district court in Texas was this done. And by the way, that ruling only pertains to the litigants. And I know I'm using a little bit of legalese here, but sometimes you can have a court case where the conclusion of the case does not pertain to everybody in the entire country. It pertains only to the litigants in that case and perhaps only to that legal district in Texas. So don't just take my word for it. Let me give you the opinion of one of the nation's experts on this. Edward Zelensky, yes, just like the president of Ukraine, but not related. Edward Zelensky, who's professor at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law and specializes in tax law, he's one of the nation's experts, said the following: "It is a compromise in a district court in Texas that will have as a legal matter no basis in precedent. In other words, it will not set a precedent. This is not a federal judge writing an opinion," Zelensky said. So while it is a victory for people like me who oppose the Johnson Amendment and believe that Johnson was just trying to protect his own office and wasn't doing us good in terms of the whole scope of American history, the fact is we've not had a national undoing of the Johnson Amendment, an overthrowing, a congressional act, a rewriting of the IRS code. We've simply had the twin victories, again, for those of us who are on this side of the issue, of a district court in Texas ruling a certain way and the Trump administration saying we're not going to pay attention to it. But if, poof, tomorrow, let's take a possible Democrat leader. Let's say tomorrow Gavin Newsom from California was the president of the United States, having won, the Democratic nomination and the national election. I know I'm making things up, but just as an example, he could begin to prosecute. He could activate the IRS. He could prosecute or make sure prosecutions were happening on the basis of the Johnson Amendment to the IRS code because it still is there and exists. So my clergy friends, I want to say to you, if you believe that Christian leaders, not just Christians, but all of you clergy who listen, I've got rabbis and mullahs, and I'm thrilled for all of you listening. Forgive me if occasionally I address my audience as though you're all Christians. It's just my laziness in the moment. But if my religious leader friends listening to this podcast, if you are going to speak of politics in your religious organizations, teach people how to think in terms of your faith. Teach people how to think about politics. Teach them how to apply faith to politics. Great. But I urge you strongly to be careful about endorsing candidates. And I urge this for two reasons. Number one, the law could boomerang on you. We have not had an overturning of the Johnson Amendment. It is still on the books. You just have a presidential administration that's not going to push it, and you have a relatively local district court in Texas that's given a victory to some organizations prosecuting or filing for their rights. The second reason, now this is coming more from my mind and heart, I believe that a good religious leader should teach people the principles, the truths that lead to certain political conclusions and certain political actions and a certain way of voting. But I don't think the issue is just to fall into a personality cult and endorse certain candidates. I've seen this for years. I've watched it closely. It's an area of my study, and I've watched churches have certain candidates in. The clergy fawn all over them. The candidate makes a lightly religious talk, and everybody's thrilled, and it sounds like they're with them religiously. It's somewhat of an endorsement. But never is that religious leadership teaching their congregation how to think, call it what you will, biblically, religiously, morally, about politics. And so they're not growing their people. They're not maturing their people. They're just engaging in kind of a personality called, oh, Hillary Clinton's in our church today, or, oh, Ronald Reagan speaking in our church, or that kind of thing. And it becomes about the individual apart from principle. It's easy to get attached to a person, but you're meant to be teaching your congregations principles and truths and the great truths of theology, and yes, even some things about American history. So I applaud you for being bold about your faith speaking to every area of life. I speak as a Christian for a moment. I believe that my faith speaks to every area of life. I'm going to speak to the issue of reproductive rights. I'm going to speak to the issue of immigration. I'm going to speak to the issue of racial justice. I'm going to speak to the cause of the poor because my faith speaks to all of that. That's what's in Scripture. That's what I believe. That's what my Lord, I'm a Christian. I'm committed to Jesus Christ. That's what He addresses. And that's often why I blur the lines politically, because I'm as concerned about the poor as I am about a strong defense. I'm as concerned about social justice and an end of racism, which is unbiblical, as I am about abortion. These are all equal issues for me, and I'm on all of them. So sometimes I sound like a Democrat. Sometimes I sound like a Republican. But what I'm trying to do is be biblical, is be Christian, is be as I perceive Jesus Christ would be on these issues. Okay, what's my point? My point is that for me to pastor a church and just say, we're all going to vote for old Clayton Jones over here who's running for office, and everybody gets excited about Clayton Jones, and maybe Clayton Jones has some gifts, put some pulpiteering gifts, and so he quotes Scripture and cries about Mama when she prayed for him and all that kind of thing, and everybody votes for him. But nobody's better at thinking things through from the basis of their faith. Nobody's better in my congregation, if I do it that way, at applying faith to the real world in a way that brings redemptive change. So I'm cautioning you, clergy, two things. First of all, the law is not gone. It might boomerang on you. Be careful. Number two, I'm not sure that our main focus is meant to be endorsing candidates anyway. Our main focus is to think a certain way. And I think you can be a very effective religious leader leading your congregation and never mention the candidates, just mention the issues. And that makes a more mature congregation. And that keeps you out of legal harm. And that keeps you out of personality cults. And that, I think, also, if you want to be real straightforward about it, it appeals to a broader range of people who will come to your church, and therefore you can have more influence in society. So let me summarize. There's no question there's been a backing away from the Johnson Amendment in our generation. The Johnson Amendment should never have occurred in the first place. However, I want you to know it's still on the books. The Texas ruling is not universal. And there's also wisdom in not thinking, hot dog, now we can put a painting of our favorite candidate in the foyer of our church. I think that's unwise to begin with, and it misses the better issue, the more important issue, of growing a mature people who can apply faith to the real world in a redemptive way. So beware, be thoughtful. I'm not afraid of a change in administrations, but I don't want to see anybody hurt because of certain false reporting in certain overexcited, particularly right-wing publications that say, hey, it's over. It's not. And I also want you to think through what it means to speak from your pulpit into the world of politics anyway, something I want you to do, but it's beyond just endorsing a certain candidate. Proud of you providing courageous leadership. Hopefully I can add a layer of understanding to the nature of our times.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator in international media. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.